The vicar, Reverend Charles Thornton, was not a man prone to dramatic gestures, which made his sudden pallor all the more unsettling. He read the letter a second time, his lips moving soundlessly, before carefully placing it on the nearest table as though it might combust if held any longer. The constable, a competent enough man named Wilson, who had served Thornfield for nearly 12 years, leaned in to read the contents, and Miss Marple observed how his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Within minutes, the fair had transformed from a pleasant community gathering into something altogether more charged with unease. Constable Wilson made a brief announcement, requesting that no one leave the hall until they had spoken with him. The statement, delivered with professional courtesy, nonetheless sent a ripple of anxiety through the assembled villagers. People exchanged glances. Some set down their purchases. Others drew closer in small clusters, their voices dropping to urgent whispers. Miss Marple remained exactly where she was, her hands folded in her lap, her expression one of benign interest. She had learned long ago that the best position from which to observe human nature was one of apparent invisibility. People rarely noticed an elderly woman with knitting, particularly when they were preoccupied with their own concerns and speculation. The letter, Miss Marple gathered from the fragments of conversation now circulating through the hall, contained a confession of sorts. The vicar had been reluctant to share the details, but the nature of gossip being what it was, particularly in a village the size of Thornfield, certain essential facts began to emerge. The letter admitted to a crime, a serious one, but it provided no name, no signature, no indication of the writer's identity. This was what had so thoroughly unsettled both the vicar and the constable. A confession without a confessor was an exceedingly unusual thing. It suggested either someone consumed by guilt who feared the consequences of identification, or, and this was the possibility that seemed to trouble Constable Wilson most deeply, someone engaged in a far more sinister game. Catherine Merton had quietly set down her teacup and excused herself from the refreshment area. She stood now near the window, her back to the room, her posture rigid. Miss Marple noted that Catherine's hands, visible against the dove-grey coat, were trembling slightly. Whether from fear, shock, or guilt was impossible to determine from observation alone, though Miss Marple had found that trembling hands could arise from any number of emotional states, and one must be careful not to assume too much from a single symptom. Robert Ashford, the man to whom Catherine had once been engaged, stood near the book's display with his wife, Eleanor. Eleanor was a handsome woman of perhaps 35, with the sort of assured manner that came from marrying well and inheriting considerable social position. She was speaking to her husband in tones too low to hear, but her eyes kept drifting toward Catherine with an expression that suggested neither sympathy nor surprise, but something more akin to grim satisfaction. The postman, who had inadvertently delivered this troublesome missive, remained by the door, looking distinctly uncomfortable. He was a younger man, not yet 30, named Henry Chambers, and he was explaining to anyone who would listen that the letter had simply appeared in that morning's post-delivery, indistinguishable from any other correspondence. He had not noticed anything unusual about it, though he acknowledged now, under questioning, that the handwriting was indeed peculiar. Reverend Thornton stood in conversation with Constable Wilson, and Miss Marple could see that the vicar was troubled by more than merely the letter's contents. There was something else, some additional dimension to his distress that expressed itself in the way he periodically glanced toward the letter itself, then away, as though the sight of it caused him particular discomfort. The letter would need to be taken to the police station in the neighboring town of Ashford Vale, Constable Wilson explained, where it would be examined more thoroughly. The handwriting would be analyzed, the paper would be tested, but in the interim, it was crucial that no one leave Thornfield. The confession, vague though it was, made this a matter of some urgency. Miss Marple watched as Margaret Hastings moved to stand beside Catherine Merton at the window. Whatever private conversation passed between them was conducted in whispers, but Miss Marple observed that Margaret's hand briefly touched Catherine's arm, a gesture that suggested either compassion or perhaps warning. The fair continued around them, though the atmosphere had altered irretrievably. People made their purchases with distracted courtesy. The usual laughter and casual greetings had given way to a more subdued tone. The autumn light seemed to grow dimmer, though this was surely only an illusion created by the sudden tension that now inhabited the parish hall. It was as the vicar was speaking with Constable Wilson that Miss Marple noticed something else, a detail so small, so apparently insignificant, that she suspected she might be the only person in the room who had registered it at all. When Reverend Thornton had first read the letter, his initial reaction had not been mere shock or surprise. There had been recognition in his expression. A flash of understanding that suggested, however briefly, that some part of the letter's contents had not come as an utter surprise. Miss Marple began to consider the possibilities, the pattern, the hidden connections that might bind these people together. The letter, without a name, had arrived, and now the true work would begin. Not the official investigation that Constable Wilson would undoubtedly conduct, but the far more subtle and intricate investigation of human nature that had always been Miss Marple's particular domain. By late afternoon, the autumn fair had been formally concluded, and Constable Wilson had established a temporary interview space in the vicar's private study. He had requested that certain individuals remain available for questioning, while others had been permitted to depart with the clear understanding that they must not leave the village without further notice. The letter itself had been carefully placed in an evidence envelope, and arrangements were being made for its transfer to the county police headquarters in Ashford Vale. Miss Marple had returned to her cottage on the High Street, a modest property with a small but meticulously maintained garden. She had settled herself in her sitting room with a pot of tea and her knitting, though her mind was far too occupied with the morning's events to maintain any real focus on the Fair Isle pattern she had been attempting. Instead, she found herself considering what little she actually knew about the crime that the anonymous letter had confessed to. The vicar, in his distress, had mentioned only that the letter spoke of a death, a recent one, though the timeline remained unclear. He had not specified whether it was an accident, a suicide, or a murder, though the very fact that someone felt compelled to confess suggested that guilt, rather than mere responsibility, was the driving force behind the correspondence. It was at 4:30 when Miss Marple received a visitor. This was not unusual in itself. She was frequently visited by villagers seeking conversation or advice, but the particular visitor was somewhat unexpected. It was Eleanor Ashford, Robert's wife, who appeared at her door with an expression of barely suppressed agitation. Eleanor entered the sitting room with the ease of someone accustomed to being received, though Miss Marple noted that she declined the offer of tea with more haste than courtesy demanded. There was something feverish about Eleanor's manner, a kind of restless energy that expressed itself in the way she moved about the room rather than settling into a chair. "Miss Marple," Eleanor began without preamble, "I felt it necessary to speak with you privately. Given your reputation for discretion and understanding of village matters, I thought you might appreciate hearing certain facts before they perhaps become distorted through the usual channels of gossip." Miss Marple set down her knitting with an expression of interested attention. Though she said nothing, she had found that silence was often the most effective tool in encouraging people to reveal what they truly wished to communicate. Eleanor took this as an invitation to continue. She began to speak about Catherine Merton, about the broken engagement 5 years prior, about the circumstances that had led to Catherine's departure from the village. According to Eleanor's account, Catherine's father had been found dead in his study, ostensibly from a heart attack. The death had been sudden, unexpected, and it had come at a time when Catherine's engagement to Robert had been the subject of considerable village discussion. "What you should understand," Eleanor said, her voice taking on a harder edge, "is that Catherine's behavior before her departure was quite peculiar. She was secretive, nervous, unlike herself entirely. And there were rumors, merely rumors, you understand, but persistent ones, that her engagement to Robert had ended, not amicably, but rather violently, that there had been some sort of confrontation." Miss Marple considered this information with her characteristic patience. "And you believe that the letter today concerns Mr. Merton's death?" she asked gently. Eleanor's response was not a direct answer. Instead, she said, "Catherine has returned to the village with considerable financial resources. Her father's estate was substantial, and it passed entirely to her. That alone would be unremarkable, except that there were debts, Miss Marple. Her father had incurred considerable debts in the months before his death, debts that should have consumed much of the estate. Yet somehow, Catherine appears to have inherited an amount that suggests those debts either never existed or were somehow resolved. It was a subtle accusation, delivered with the sort of precision that suggested Eleanor had given considerable thought to how to present her information. Miss Marple noted, however, that Eleanor had not come to her out of a simple desire for idle conversation. There was something else motivating her visit, some deeper concern that expressed itself in the way her eyes kept returning to the window, as though she feared being observed. "Why have you come to tell me this, Mrs. Ashford?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Eleanor's composure wavered slightly. She stood, moving to the window herself, and for a moment she remained silent. When she spoke again, her voice had lost some of its brittle quality. "Because I am frightened," she said simply. "I am frightened that whatever is happening now, this letter, this investigation, will somehow bring to light matters that are better left undisturbed." Robert was very young when Catherine was engaged to him. He was not entirely stable during that period. If certain facts about what occurred between him and Catherine were to emerge, it could be extremely damaging. Miss Marple absorbed this information without visible reaction. "You believe your husband may be implicated in some way?" "I believe," Eleanor said carefully, "that there are things that happened 5 years ago which no one has ever fully explained. And I believe that Catherine Merton knows what those things were. And I further believe that her return to this village at this particular moment may be connected to matters that are far more serious than anyone is yet acknowledging." She left shortly thereafter, declining Miss Marple's renewed offer of tea and departing with the same agitated energy with which she had arrived. Miss Marple returned to her window and watched Eleanor's figure disappear down the high street. Her pace quickened, her posture suggesting a woman burdened by knowledge she was not entirely certain how to manage. The autumn light was fading rapidly now, and the village was settling into the particular quiet that came with approaching evening. Yet Miss Marple found herself contemplating the pattern that was beginning to emerge, connections between Catherine Merton, her father's mysterious death, Robert Ashford's troubled past, and the anonymous confession that had arrived that very morning. She picked up her knitting again, but her needles clicked with a different rhythm now, slower, more thoughtful, like a chess player considering multiple moves ahead. The following morning brought with it the kind of grey, drizzling rain that seemed to seep into the very foundations of Thornfield, dampening not only the physical landscape, but the spirits of its inhabitants. Miss Marple had risen early, as was her custom, and had taken her breakfast while listening to the wireless and observing the rain streak the windows of her cottage. By 9 o'clock she had dressed herself carefully in her usual attire, a modest dress in grey wool, sensible shoes, and a cardigan that had been knitted by her O.W.N. hands some years prior, and had ventured out into the damp morning with her umbrella. Her destination was not random. Miss Marple had spent much of the previous evening considering what she knew and, more importantly, what she needed to learn. Eleanor Ashford's visit had provided useful information, certainly, but it had also raised questions that required answers from sources other than village gossip. One did not, Miss Marple had learned, build a complete understanding of human affairs by relying solely on what people chose to tell you. One had to observe, to inquire carefully, and to piece together the fragments of truth scattered across multiple perspectives. She found Dr. Hastings at his surgery, just as she had anticipated. He was a man of habit, and his morning surgeries were legendary for their punctuality. The doctor had been serving Thornfield for some 20 years, long enough to have accumulated considerable knowledge about the village's medical histories and, consequently, its secrets. Physical ailments, Miss Marple had observed, often revealed themselves to be manifestations of deeper troubles, grief, anxiety, stress, or guilt. Dr. Hastings received her with the warm familiarity of a man who had come to regard her as both patient and friend. He offered her tea, which she accepted with gracious thanks, and settled himself into his chair with an expression of mild curiosity regarding the nature of her visit. "I have been thinking about poor Mr. Merton," Miss Marple began, her approach subtle and indirect as it always was. "His death was quite sudden, as I recall. 5 years ago this spring, was it not? I remember because it coincided with the village's decision to plant new roses in the churchyard." Dr. Hastings' expression grew more somber. "Yes, Edward's death was indeed unexpected. A heart attack, we believed, though the circumstances were somewhat unusual." Miss Marple accepted this opening with the gentleness of someone inviting a confidence rather than demanding one. "Unusual in what manner, Doctor?" Hastings set down his teacup with deliberate care. "Edward had been under considerable stress," he said after a moment's hesitation. "Professionally, I mean. There had been some irregularities in his practice. Nothing criminal, you understand, but matters that had troubled him greatly. He had mentioned to me, in the strictest confidence, that he was considering retirement, that he wished to put certain affairs in order before doing so." "What sort of irregularities?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "I really cannot say," Hastings replied, though his reluctance seemed more about professional discretion than genuine ignorance. "Solicitor-client privilege and all that. But I will say this. Edward was a conscientious man, perhaps overly so. When he discovered that certain matters had been handled improperly, it weighed heavily upon him. Very heavily indeed." Miss Marple absorbed this information, filing it away alongside what Eleanor had told her about the mysterious resolution of Edward Merton's debts. "And his death itself? There was an examination, I presume?" "Of course," Hastings said. "The post-mortem was straightforward. Myocardial infarction, a heart attack, plainly and simply. There was no suggestion of anything untoward. His heart had been failing him for some time, though he had made light of it. The stress, combined with his physical condition, simply proved too much." Miss Marple rose to leave shortly thereafter, thanking the doctor for his time and his candor. But as she was collecting her umbrella, he called after her with something of an afterthought. "Miss Marple, I hope you will forgive me for asking, but your questions this morning, they seem to suggest that Edward's death may be connected to this Bazine." "With the letter yesterday?" Miss Marple turned back with her characteristic expression of innocent curiosity. "I have no reason to believe so, Doctor. Merely the idle speculations of an old woman with perhaps too much time for reflection. Though I confess that I have always found Mr. Merton's death somewhat curious. A man does not simply decide to retire and put his affairs in order without some considerable catalyst." She departed before he could press further, but not before she had observed the troubled expression that crossed his face, the expression of a man who possessed knowledge. He was uncertain whether he ought to share. Her next call was at the post office, where she purchased some thread she did not particularly need and engaged in a brief conversation with the postmistress, Mrs. Eleanor Finch. The post office was, as always, a repository of information. Mrs. Finch had been observing the comings and goings of the village's residents for nearly 30 years, and very little escaped her notice. By careful inquiry, Miss Marple ascertained that Catherine Merton had indeed received considerable correspondence in the weeks since her return, letters from solicitors, from financial institutions, from various official bodies. There had also been a letter received approximately 3 weeks prior, bearing a postmark from London, that Mrs. Finch had noted because the handwriting on the envelope had seemed deliberately disguised. Catherine had opened it immediately upon receipt, and Mrs. Finch had observed through the shop window that her reaction had been quite pronounced, though whether shock or distress or something else entirely, it was impossible to determine from external observation alone. By late morning, Miss Marple had returned to her cottage, thoroughly dampened by the persistent rain, but considerably enriched in her understanding of the village's undercurrent. The pattern was becoming clearer, though it remained incomplete. There were still crucial pieces missing, pieces that would require careful observation and, perhaps, a bit of deliberate intervention on her part. She was settling herself with fresh tea when a knock came at her door. It was Constable Wilson, looking somewhat harried and decidedly less competent than he had appeared the previous day. "Miss Marple," he began without preamble, "I wonder if you might spare me a few moments. There are certain aspects of this investigation that I believe would benefit from your particular perspective." Miss Marple invited Constable Wilson into her sitting room with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to receiving visitors of all varieties. She settled him in the chair recently vacated by Eleanor Ashford, offered him tea, which he accepted with visible relief, and waited with her characteristic patience for him to articulate the precise nature of his inquiry. Wilson was a capable man in his own way, but he was not particularly imaginative, and his approach to investigation tended toward the methodical rather than the intuitive. He had spent the better part of the previous evening interviewing the individuals present at the fair, and the process had left him considerably frustrated. The letter itself had been delivered to the county police, where it was undergoing examination by specialists who would likely require several days to provide their analysis. In the interim, Wilson found himself in the uncomfortable position of conducting an investigation into a crime whose nature remained imprecisely defined. The difficulty, Wilson explained, is that the letter makes a confession but provides no specifics. It speaks of guilt and of a death, but it does not clarify whether that death was accidental, self-inflicted, or the result of some action taken by the writer. Withal, knowing precisely what crime we are investigating, it becomes nearly impossible to proceed with conventional methodology. Miss Marple listened attentively, her hands occupied with a particularly intricate piece of crochet work. "And what do the handwriting experts suggest?" she inquired. "That the handwriting is deliberately disguised," Wilson said with evident frustration. "The letters are printed in a manner that suggests the writer was attempting to obscure their natural style. It could be someone writing with their non-dominant hand, or someone who has taken considerable pains to alter their usual script. Either way, it provides us with very little to work upon." "Tell me," Miss Marple said gently, "what was your impression of the various individuals present at the fair yesterday? Particularly those individuals with whom you conducted interviews." Wilson set down his teacup and consulted his notebook, a habit that Miss Marple found both endearing and limiting. It suggested a mind that required external aids to organize its observations, rather than one that could synthesize information into coherent patterns. "Catherine Merton was notably anxious," Wilson began, "though that might be expected given her history in the village and the general circumstances. She claims to have no knowledge of the letter or its contents. She has been living a quiet life since her return, spending most of her time occupied with the restoration of her father's house. She acknowledges that her reappearance in the village has been met with some coldness, but she insists that she is determined to remain and to rebuild her life here." "And does she have any theory regarding who might have sent the letter?" Miss Marple asked. "She does not," Wilson said. "In fact, she seems genuinely puzzled by it. There was no indication of deception in her manner, though I acknowledge that I am not as skilled as some in detecting such things." Miss Marple made a small sound of acknowledgement and continued her crochet. "And what of Mr. and Mrs. Ashford?" "They both insist they have no knowledge of any crime," Wilson said. "Robert Ashford claims to have only brief acquaintance with Catherine Merton, ancient history as he put it, and his wife Eleanor was similarly uninformative, though I will say that Eleanor Ashford seemed somewhat anxious during the interview, though again this might be attributable to the general disturbance caused by the letter's arrival." Miss Marple's needles paused for just a moment. "Did either of them provide any particular insights regarding the nature of the crime confessed to in the letter?" "No," Wilson admitted. "Neither of them seemed to possess any more knowledge than anyone else in the village, though Eleanor did remark somewhat obliquely that she hoped this business would not dredge up old matters that were better left undisturbed. When I pressed her for clarification, she declined to elaborate. This was precisely what Miss Marple had expected. Eleanor had come to her in hopes that some private warning might be transmitted to Robert, some way of protecting whatever secrets the Ashfords were harboring. But Eleanor, for all her intelligence, had not fully anticipated that events might already be spiraling beyond anyone's capacity to contain them. "And what of the vicar himself?" Miss Marple inquired. "Reverend Thornton must have been considerably distressed to receive such a letter." Wilson nodded slowly. "He was indeed, though I confess I found his distress somewhat curious. He seemed less shocked by the letter's arrival than one might expect, and more troubled by its contents. When I asked him if he recognized any indication of the writer's identity, he became quite evasive." Miss Marple set down her crochet work entirely now. Full attention focused upon Wilson. In what manner was he evasive? He insisted that he could not possibly know who had written the letter, Wilson said, but there was something in his manner that suggested he might have suspicions. He kept saying things like, "I cannot be certain, and it would be wrong to speculate," which are the remarks of someone who very much wishes to speculate, but believes himself constrained by some obligation. This was a piece of considerable importance, Miss Marple reflected. Reverend Thornton was a man bound by the seal of the confessional, a man for whom certain confidences carried the weight of sacred obligation. If Catherine Merton had at some point confessed to him, either directly or through the sacrament itself, then he would be constrained from revealing her involvement, even if he suspected it. "Tell me, Constable," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "have you made any inquiries regarding the circumstances of Mr. Edward Merton's death 5 years ago?" Wilson looked up from his notebook with evident surprise. "Why would I inquire into a death that occurred 5 years in the past? The man died of a heart attack. There was an examination, a post-mortem. The matter was concluded." "Precisely so," Miss Marple said softly. "And yet, the timing of Catherine Merton's return to the village, combined with the arrival of this anonymous confession, suggests that perhaps something in that concluded matter has recently become unconcluded." Wilson frowned, his methodical mind struggling to grasp the implication. "You believe the letter concerns Mr. Merton's death?" "I believe," Miss Marple said carefully, "that it would be wise to investigate all possibilities thoroughly before assuming that we understand the matter completely. And I believe that you will find, upon further inquiry, that the 5-year-old death and the present confession are inextricably connected." Wilson departed shortly thereafter, his notebook now containing several additional lines of inquiry to pursue. Miss Marple watched from her window as he made his way back toward the police station, his pace suggesting a man whose understanding of his own investigation had fundamentally shifted. The rain continued its persistent drizzle, and the village settled into the rhythm of a normal day, unaware that the careful equilibrium that had been maintained for 5 years was now beginning to fracture. The rain persisted throughout the afternoon and into the evening, creating an atmosphere of confinement that seemed to press upon the village with increasing weight. By the time the evening darkness had settled fully over Thornfield, Constable Wilson had completed his revised investigation into Edward Merton's death, and his findings had prompted him to request a meeting with Miss Marple, this time at her insistence rather than his own initiative. He arrived at her cottage shortly after 7 o'clock, bringing with him a folder of documents that he laid out upon her small dining table with the precision of a man who had discovered something that demanded careful examination. The post-mortem report on Edward Merton had been remarkably straightforward in its original conclusion, but Wilson had now obtained the complete file, including details that had been deemed peripheral to the primary finding. "You were correct," Wilson said without preamble, his tone suggesting a mixture of frustration and reluctant admiration. "There were irregularities that were noted in the initial examination but never fully pursued. The pathologist mentioned in his report that, while the primary cause of death was indeed a myocardial infarction, there were certain secondary findings that were unusual." Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and examined the documentation with care. "All attention. What manner of unusual findings?" "Traces of a sedative in his system," Wilson said. "A fairly substantial dose, according to the analysis. Enough to cause drowsiness and impaired judgment, though not necessarily enough to be immediately fatal. The pathologist noted it in his report, but concluded that it was likely self-administered, possibly by Mr. Merton himself, in an attempt to manage his anxiety. Given that he died of a heart attack, the sedative was considered incidental rather than causative." Miss Marple set down the document and regarded Wilson with an expression of grave thoughtfulness. And yet, a man does not typically take a substantial sedative without some reason or purpose, particularly a man of Mr. Merton's methodical nature. "Precisely," Wilson agreed. "When I began asking questions about the days immediately preceding his death, I discovered something rather remarkable. There is a chemist in Ashford Vale, the neighboring town, who kept detailed records. And according to those records, a prescription for a strong sedative was filled approximately 1 week before Mr. Merton's death. The prescription was signed by Dr. Hastings and was filled under Mr. Merton's name, Miss Marple's needles, which she had picked up out of habit, stilled in her lap. "Did you inquire of Dr. Hastings regarding this prescription?" "I did," Wilson said, and his discomfort was evident. The doctor became quite defensive. He insisted that he had not prescribed such a medication, that the prescription must be a forgery. He suggested that someone had impersonated him or falsified his signature. He was quite adamant, in fact, almost violently so. This was a detail of considerable importance. A man as careful as Dr. Hastings would not have become defensive without cause, Miss Marple reflected. Either he had indeed prescribed the medication and was now denying it for reasons related to the circumstances under which he had done so, or someone had very deliberately forged his name, which suggested premeditation and planning of a sophisticated nature. "Have you considered the possibility," Miss Marple asked gently, "that Dr. Hastings might have prescribed the medication at someone else's request? That he might have been persuaded to do so by someone in whom he had considerable trust, or someone who possessed information that would have obligated him to comply?" Wilson stared at her for a long moment, his practical mind working through the implications. "You believe that someone blackmailed the doctor into prescribing the sedative?" "I believe," Miss Marple said carefully, "that there are many forms of persuasion available to those who are sufficiently motivated. Some involve threats, others involve appeals to conscience, and still others involve promises or inducements. Without knowing more about Dr. Hastings' circumstances at that particular time, it is difficult to determine which form of persuasion might have been employed." Wilson stood and began to pace about the small room, a habit that Miss Marple had come to recognize as indicative of his mind working through complex problems. If the sedative was indeed administered deliberately, and if it was a factor in Mr. Merton's death, even if not the direct cause, then we may be investigating a case of manslaughter at minimum, or possibly murder. And now someone has decided that their conscience can no longer bear the weight of that secret, Miss Marple observed. The anonymous letter suggests that guilt has finally overcome whatever considerations previously enforced silence. But who would have had both motive and opportunity? Wilson demanded. Who would have benefited from Edward Merton's death? Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved to a window, peering out into the rain-dar. Kent Street. That is a question that requires careful consideration, Constable. But I would suggest that you might begin by examining not only who benefited directly from his death, but also who benefited from his death occurring at precisely that moment in time. A matter of timing can often be as significant as the act itself. She turned back to regard him with her characteristic expression of innocent wisdom. And I would further suggest that you inquire into the nature of the irregularities in Mr. Merton's professional practice, the ones that had troubled him so greatly. Those irregularities may have provided the motive that prompted someone to take the action they have now confessed to. Wilson collected his documents with the air of a man who had received important direction but was not yet entirely certain how to proceed. Before he departed, however, he paused at the door and asked a question that Miss Marple had been anticipating. "Miss Marple, do you suspect Catherine Merton? Your questions have circled about her return to the village, her father's death, the mysterious resolution of his debts. Surely you suspect that she is somehow involved in this matter?" Miss Marple smiled with gentle reproach. "Suspicion, Constable, is a dangerous thing. It clouds judgment and leads one toward false conclusions. What I know is that Catherine Merton has returned to the village after 5 years of absence, that she has considerable financial resources that cannot easily be accounted for, and that her reappearance coincides with the arrival of an anonymous confession. These are facts, but facts alone do not constitute guilt." She paused, considering her words with care. "I would suggest instead that you consider who among the village residents would have had most to lose if the true circumstances of Edward Merton's death were to become known. The guilty party is often the person who seems most obviously implicated, but rather the person whose apparent innocence is most carefully constructed. After Wilson's departure, Miss Marple remained at her window, watching the rain stream down the glass in rivulets that distorted the street lamp's reflection into abstract patterns. The pieces of the puzzle were assembling themselves in her mind, forming a picture that grew more distinct with each new discovery. But there remained one crucial element that she had not yet fully understood. The true catalyst that had prompted the anonymous confession after so many years of silence. Someone in the village was harboring a secret so profound that it could no longer be contained, and that person's decision to confess would inevitably lead to revelations that would alter Thornfield forever. The following morning brought a significant development that seemed to crystallize the investigation in an entirely unexpected direction. Constable Wilson arrived at Miss Marple's cottage before 9 o'clock, his expression indicating that sleep had eluded him throughout the night. He carried with him a new piece of evidence, a letter that had been delivered to the police station early that morning, addressed directly to him and marked urgent. This second letter was written in the same deliberately disguised handwriting as the first, but its contents were far more specific. It contained a confession not merely to causing Edward Merton's death, but to the precise mechanism by which that death had been orchestrated. It detailed the procurement of the sedative, the administration of it to Mr. Merton in his evening tea, and the knowledge that his weakened heart would likely not survive the combination of the drug and the stress that had been deliberately induced through a particular conversation held that very afternoon. But most significantly, the letter contained information that only the perpetrator could possibly have known. Information about Edward Merton's final moments, about where precisely he had been sitting when the attack occurred, about the specific words he had spoken before collapsing. "This changes everything," Wilson said, his hands trembling slightly as he held the letter. "This is no longer a vague confession. This is detailed knowledge of a premeditated act. This is someone describing a murder." Miss Marple read the letter with meticulous attention, her pale eyes moving across each carefully printed word. When she had finished, she set it down upon the table and folded her hands in her lap with the composure of someone who had anticipated precisely this development. "The writer is growing increasingly unstable," she observed. "The second letter is more explicit, more detailed than the first. This suggests that the burden of guilt is becoming progressively more intolerable. The confession is escalating, which indicates that the writer believes some form of revelation is imminent, regardless of whether they themselves choose to remain anonymous." "But we still have no indication of who the writer might be," Wilson protested. "The handwriting analysis provides no leads. The details in the letter could theoretically have been obtained through various means." "No," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "We have far more indication than you realize, Constable. The second letter provides us with crucial information about the writer's state of mind and the circumstances that have prompted this escalation. Someone in this village has recently discovered that their secret is no longer as secure as they believed it to be. Someone has learned that questions are being asked, that the circumstances of Edward Merton's death are being examined, and that someone has decided that confessing is preferable to being publicly exposed. Over the next several hours, Miss Marple and Constable Wilson discussed the various residents of Thornfield, examining each one against the evidence that had accumulated. Dr. Hastings' suspicious denial regarding the prescription. Margaret Hastings' strange behavior toward Catherine Merton. Robert Ashford's troubled history, and Eleanor Ashford's anxious warning. Reverend Thornton's apparent knowledge that he was constrained from revealing. Even Henry Chambers, the young postman, seemed to possess some peculiar knowledge that he was reluctant to articulate. But it was a seemingly insignificant conversation that Miss Marple had overheard at the fair, a brief exchange between two villagers discussing Edward Merton's final weeks, that suddenly crystallized into profound significance in her mind. "I believe," she said to Wilson late in the afternoon, "that I must speak with Dr. Hastings. Alone, if you would permit it. There are certain matters that he may be more inclined to discuss with me than with official representatives of the law." Wilson was reluctant to permit this deviation from proper procedure, but he had come to recognize that Miss Marple's methods, however unconventional, had proven remarkably effective. He agreed to wait at her cottage while she made her call upon the doctor. Dr. Hastings received her in his study, a room lined with medical texts and correspondence. He was a man in his late 50s, with the appearance of someone whose mind was constantly occupied with matters of considerable concern. When Miss Marple entered, he rose with courtesy, but his expression suggested apprehension rather than pleasure at the visit. Miss Marple came directly to the point, a departure from her usual circuitous method that immediately indicated the seriousness of her purpose. "Doctor, I have come to speak with you about Edward Merton's death, and about the circumstances that compelled you to prescribe a sedative that you have now denied prescribing." Hastings' face paled. He sat down heavily in his chair, and for a long moment he did not speak. When he finally did, his voice was barely audible. "I did not wish to harm him," he said. "You must understand that. I was confronted with a situation in which I was presented with two impossible choices, and I was assured that no permanent harm would result. I was promised that it would merely induce sleep, nothing more. I was assured that the intention was only to remove Edward temporarily from a situation that had become untenable." Miss Marple remained standing, her posture conveying both sympathy and the gravity of the moment. "Who gave you these assurances, Doctor?" Hastings looked up at her with eyes filled with anguish. "It was someone I trusted implicitly, someone whose own desperation I could not ignore, someone whose life would have been destroyed if Edward had not been temporarily incapacitated. And I truly believed, that the sedative would do nothing more than cause sleep." The room seemed to grow colder as the implications of his words settled between them. Miss Marple moved to the window, her gaze fixed upon the rain-dampened garden beyond. "But Edward Merton did not simply sleep," she said quietly. "The combination of the sedative with his existing heart condition, and possibly with whatever stress or emotional shock accompanied his sedation, proved fatal. And you have spent 5 years living with the knowledge that your action, whatever your intentions, contributed to his death." "Yes," Hastings whispered. "Yes, precisely that." Miss Marple turned back to face him. "And Margaret knows. Your wife has known all along, hasn't she? That is why she cannot bring herself to be civil to Catherine Merton. That is why she has observed Catherine's return with such evident anxiety. Because Catherine's presence in the village threatens to expose the secret that you and Margaret have guarded so carefully." Hastings' silence was confirmation enough. Miss Marple moved toward the door, her expression one of profound sadness rather than judgment. "You must tell Constable Wilson the truth, Doctor. The anonymous letters suggest that someone else knows what occurred, and if you do not provide a full accounting, that person's confession will implicate you even more severely. Confession, though painful, is infinitely preferable to the alternative." She departed, leaving Dr. Hastings to contemplate the ruins of the life he had so carefully constructed over 5 years of silence. Dr. Hastings did indeed contact Constable Wilson that evening, and his confession, though incomplete in certain crucial details, provided the investigation with a foundational framework that transformed from a vague inquiry into a focused interrogation of specific individuals. Hastings admitted to prescribing the sedative, admitted to being pressured into doing so by someone he refused to fully identify, and admitted to his complicity in Edward Merton's death through his negligence in failing to consider the possible consequences of his action. However, Hastings was adamant in his insistence that he had not administered the sedative himself, that he had not been present when it was given to Edward Merton, and that the person who had pressured him into prescribing it had sworn that no permanent harm would result from its administration. This distinction was crucial, for it meant that the actual perpetrator of the act, the person who had deliberately given the sedative to Edward Merton with knowledge that it might prove fatal, remained unidentified. Miss Marple listened to Constable Wilson's report of Hastings' confession with an expression of thoughtful understanding. She sat in her usual chair, her knitting needles moving with their characteristic rhythm, as Wilson recounted the details of the interview. "The doctor is protecting someone," Miss Marple said with certainty. "He has revealed enough to Abs. Of himself of the appearance of being the primary perpetrator, but he continues to shield the actual architect of Edward Merton's death. The question, therefore, is who among his circle of acquaintances possessed sufficient leverage over him to compel such protection. His wife, surely, Wilson suggested. Margaret Hastings was clearly involved in whatever occurred. Her anxiety regarding Catherine Merton suggests knowledge of something deeply troubling. Perhaps, Miss Marple acknowledged, and yet Dr. Hastings' protective behavior extends beyond what one might expect if his wife were the primary guilty party. A man might confess to lesser crimes to shield a spouse, but his manner suggests protection of someone else entirely, someone whose exposure would have consequences that extend far beyond the merely personal. She set down her knitting and regarded Wilson with an intensity that suggested she had reached some critical juncture in her analysis. "Tell me, Constable, what occurred 5 years ago that might have prompted such desperation in someone that they would resort to murder? What was happening in Thornfield at precisely that moment?" Wilson consulted his notebook, though Miss Marple suspected he would find nothing written there that would illuminate what had truly transpired. The official records of a village rarely captured the nuances of human crisis that played out in drawing rooms and private conversations. It was at that precise moment that a knock came at Miss Marple's door. This time, the visitor was Reverend Thornton himself, his clerical collar slightly askew, his expression haggard with the weight of unbearable knowledge. He entered the sitting room with the air of a man who had finally reached the limits of his endurance. "Miss Marple, Constable Wilson," he began without preamble. "I have come because I can no longer maintain the seal of the confessional in good conscience. A crime has been confessed to me, confessed in the sacrament itself, which means I am bound by the strictest confidence. And yet, I find myself confronted with the knowledge that another crime may be committed, another life destroyed, if I do not speak." Miss Marple and Constable Wilson exchanged a glance. The vicar continued, his voice trembling with the effort of breaking a sacred obligation. "5 years ago, Catherine Merton came to me in the confessional. She was in a state of profound distress. She confessed to me that she had administered a sedative to her father, given to her by Dr. Hastings at the request of Robert Ashford, who feared that Edward Merton had discovered certain financial irregularities in Robert's conduct. Robert believed that if Edward Merton exposed these irregularities, it would destroy his engagement to Catherine and ruin his prospects entirely." The room seemed to still completely. Reverend Thornton continued, his words falling like stones into still water. Catherine was under the impression that the sedative was merely intended to cause sleep, to delay her father's discovery of Robert's misconduct long enough for Robert to rectify the matter. She did not believe, and was not told, that her father's heart condition made the combination of the sedative and his emotional state potentially fatal. When Edward Merton died that evening, Catherine was devastated. She believed herself responsible, though she had acted under the direction of Robert Ashford and with the participation of Dr. Hastings. "And the anonymous letters?" Miss Marple asked gently. "They are Catherine's," Reverend Thornton said. "She has been struggling with her guilt for 5 years. She departed the village because she could not bear to remain, could not bear to face Robert, who had used her unwittingly as an instrument of her father's death. But she has returned because she believed that she could not live with the secret any longer. The first letter was an attempt to confess without revealing her identity. The second letter, more explicit and detailed, was Catherine finally accepting that confession must be complete and public. Constable Wilson had risen to his feet, his mind clearly struggling to reorganize the entire structure of his investigation. "Then Robert Ashford is the true architect of Edward Merton's death?" "In a sense," Reverend Thornton said sadly. "Though he did not intend death, he intended only a temporary incapacity, a delay that would allow him to resolve certain matters before Edward Merton discovered his misconduct. But he set in motion a sequence of events that proved fatal, and he has allowed Catherine to bear the burden of guilt for 5 years, while he has lived in apparent innocence." Miss Marple rose from her chair and moved to the window. The rain had finally ceased, and the village beyond lay illuminated in the fading autumn light. She turned back to regard both men with an expression of profound understanding. "And Eleanor Ashford," she said quietly, "has known or suspected the truth all along, which is why she came to warn me yesterday. She feared that the investigation would expose her husband's culpability, but she was also hoping, perhaps, that exposure might finally bring some resolution to the guilt that has poisoned her marriage. "What will you do, Miss Marple?" Reverend Thornton asked. "What should be done now that the truth has emerged?" Miss Marple regarded him with her characteristic gentleness. "The truth must be revealed, Reverend. Guilt that is hidden metastasizes, corrupting everything it touches. Catherine must be cleared of the burden she has carried. Robert must face the consequences of his actions, and the village must be allowed to understand what truly read, so that healing might finally begin." She turned to Constable Wilson. "I suggest, Constable, that you conduct a final interview with Mr. Robert Ashford. Ask him specifically about the financial irregularities in his conduct 5 years ago, and about his relationship with Dr. Hastings. I believe you will find that his answers will provide the final pieces of this puzzle." Robert Ashford's interview with Constable Wilson took place the following morning in the police station's formal interrogation room, a space that transformed ordinary conversations into something altogether more grave and consequential. Wilson, armed now with the confession of Reverend Thornton and the implicit admissions contained within Dr. Hastings' statement, approached the interview with considerably more confidence than he had demonstrated in his earlier investigations. Robert Ashford presented himself as a man of composure, dressed in his usual attire of country gentleman, well-tailored tweed jacket, pressed shirt, the uniform of someone accustomed to social standing and respectability. Yet beneath this careful presentation, Miss Marple, who had requested permission to observe the interview from an adjacent room, could perceive the undercurrent of anxiety that manifested itself in the slight tremor of his hands and the too frequent moistening of his lips. Wilson began with the financial irregularities, approaching the matter with deliberate directness. "Mr. Ashford, 5 years ago, your father-in-law, Edward Merton, discovered that certain funds entrusted to your management had been misappropriated. Can you explain the nature of these irregularities?" For a moment, Robert's composure wavered. He glanced toward the door, as though considering flight, before settling back into his chair with visible resignation. "Those were private matters," he began, his voice lacking conviction. "Financial difficulties that I believed I could resolve without involving others. Financial difficulties that involved the embezzlement of client funds," Wilson corrected. "Funds that did not belong to you, that you had taken from individuals whose trust you had violated. Is that not accurate?" Robert's jaw tightened. "I intended to repay every penny. I had made certain investments that I believed would yield sufficient returns to cover the shortfall without anyone ever discovering the matter. But Edward Merton discovered it," Wilson pressed. "And you became aware that he intended to expose your misconduct to the authorities. Is that correct?" "Yes," Robert said quietly. "He was preparing to file charges. He gave me a week to make alternative arrangements, but he was firm in his belief that justice must be served. He was that sort of man, methodical, honorable, incapable of compromise." Miss Marple, observing from the adjacent room through the one-way glass, noted the bitterness in Robert's tone when he spoke of Edward Merton's integrity. It was the bitterness of someone who had always resented those who could not be swayed by the same considerations that motivated him: desperation, self-preservation, the fear of social ruin. "And so you decided that Edward Merton must be removed from the situation temporarily," Wilson said. "You approached Dr. Hastings and requested that he provide a sedative. What precisely did you tell the doctor regarding your intentions?" "I told him that I needed Edward temporarily incapacitated," Robert said. "That I required time to resolve certain matters before Edward could expose my misconduct. I assured him that the sedative would do nothing more than cause sleep, that it was completely safe. I may have even suggested that it was merely a matter of delaying the inevitable, of buying time to rectify my situation." "And did you tell Dr. Hastings that? You intended to use Catherine Merton as the instrument of her father's sedation?" Robert's face flushed. "I did not intend. I never meant for Catherine to become involved," It was the doctor who suggested that possibility. He said that if Edward were sedated in the evening while in the company of his daughter, it would appear natural, accidental. Catherine would notice her father becoming drowsy and would assume it was merely fatigue. But Catherine did not know the true nature of what she was administering, Wilson observed. You deliberately manipulated her into becoming complicit in your scheme without her knowledge or consent. Is that accurate? Yes, Robert said, and his voice cracked slightly. I told her that her father was becoming overly stressed, that the doctor recommended a mild sedative to help him sleep. I asked her to ensure he took it before retiring for the evening. She complied without question because she trusted me, because she believed I was acting in her father's best interests. The confession continued, but what emerged was a portrait of calculated manipulation rather than sudden desperation. Robert had knowingly involved Catherine, had deliberately used Dr. Hastings' professional reputation and medical knowledge, and had orchestrated the entire scheme with the specific intention of temporarily removing Edward Merton from a situation that threatened his own social standing and financial security. What Robert had not anticipated was the fatal interaction between the sedative and Edward Merton's weakened heart. He had not considered the possibility that the stress of discovering his daughter's involvement in the scheme, combined with the physiological effects of the drug, might prove catastrophic. When Edward had collapsed and died, Robert had realized the magnitude of what he had set in motion, but by then it was far too late for reconsiderati. On or remediation. And in the 5 years since Edward Merton's death, Wilson asked, You have allowed Catherine Merton to believe herself responsible for her father's death? You have allowed her to bear the guilt while you lived in apparent innocence. I did not know that she believed herself responsible, Robert protested. I assumed she understood that it was merely a sedative, that her father's death was a consequence of his physical condition, not of her actions. I had no idea that she was torturing herself with guilt, yet when she returned to the village recently, Wilson pressed. You made no effort to enlighten her regarding the true nature of the scheme you had orchestrated? You offered no explanation that might have absolved her of the burden she was carrying? Robert's silence was answer enough. Miss Marple, observing from her concealed vantage point, found herself experiencing a peculiar mixture of emotions. There was the satisfaction of seeing the truth finally emerge, of understanding how the pieces of the puzzle had assembled themselves into coherent form. But there was also a profound sadness at the recognition of human weakness, at how readily people might rationalize their own culpability and shift responsibility onto others. By late afternoon, Robert Ashford had been formally charged with Edward Merton's death, not as murder, which would have been difficult to prosecute given that Robert had not actually administered the sedative, but as manslaughter through criminal negligence and conspiracy. Dr. Hastings, his role as an unwitting accomplice established, faced charges of professional misconduct and negligence, and Catherine Merton was informed, through Constable Wilson's patient explanation, that she bore no legal or moral responsibility for her father's death, that she had been a victim of manipulation and deception rather than an instrument of harm. The village of Thornfield, having endured a week of uncertainty and speculation, finally possessed the truth it had sought. Yet as Miss Marple reflected that evening, seated in her cottage with her knitting, she recognized that the truth, while clarifying, brought with it no genuine resolution. The damage had been done, lives had been altered irrevocably, and the careful social equilibrium that had existed before the anonymous letter's arrival could never be fully restored. The weeks that followed the resolution of the investigation were characterized by a peculiar quality of silence that seemed to permeate Thornfield. The village had been so thoroughly preoccupied with the mystery of Edward Merton's death that its sudden clarification left behind a vacuum that no amount of ordinary village gossip could adequately fill. The autumn gave way to early winter, and the bare branches of the trees that lined the high street seemed to mirror the emotional barrenness that had settled over the community. Eleanor Ashford had departed from the village with remarkable swiftness, taking with her only the most essential possessions and leaving behind a house that would eventually be sold to distant relatives who had no connection to Thornfield's social fabric. She had not waited for the formal proceedings against her husband to conclude, had not attempted to maintain any pretense of loyalty or support. Her departure was in its own way a form of confession, an acknowledgement that she had known far more than she had initially admitted, and that she could no longer bear to remain in a place where the truth of her complicity had become so evident. Robert Ashford himself remained in custody, awaiting trial in a county prison located some 20 miles from Thornfield. Eleanor's solicitors were handling the divorce proceedings with professional efficiency, and the Ashford estate was, in the process of being divided and liquidated. What had once been one of the village's most prominent families was being systematically dismantled, piece by piece, until nothing remained but the empty house and the memories of what had been destroyed. Dr. Hastings had submitted his resignation from his medical practice, and a younger physician from Ashford Vale had been brought in to serve the village's medical needs. The doctor's departure was accompanied by neither fanfare nor public acknowledgement. He simply ceased appearing at his surgery one morning, and by afternoon his house had been shuttered and marked with a solicitor's notice indicating that it had been placed on the market. Miss Marple had observed him departing with his wife Margaret, and had noted the way they sat in their motor car without speaking, their silence more eloquent than any words could have been. It was this particular silence, the silence of people who had once shared a secret understanding and now possessed only recriminations, that had struck Miss Marple most forcefully. Margaret Hastings's complicity in Edward Merton's death had been less direct than her husband's, but no less real. She had known what her husband had been asked to do. She had known the pressure being exerted upon him, and she had permitted the arrangement to proceed, had perhaps even encouraged it in some unspoken way. The village had initially treated Catherine Merton with a mixture of pity and awkward civility in the days immediately following the revelation of her innocence. Yet this sympathy had proven to be superficial, rooted more in the relief that the true culprit had been identified than in any genuine reconsideration of Catherine herself. The fact that she had been manipulated, had been used as an unwitting instrument, had somehow failed to entirely redeem her in the eyes of Thornfield society. There remained an underlying sense that she was somehow tainted by her association with the crime, regardless of how innocent her participation had been. It was on a grey afternoon in early November that Catherine Merton came to call upon Miss Marple. She arrived dressed in mourning clothes, though whether these were for her father or for the loss of her hopes to rebuild her life in Thornfield remained ambiguous. She accepted Miss Marple's offer of tea with quiet gratitude and settled herself into the chair opposite her hostess with the careful movements of someone who had become unaccustomed to ordinary social interaction. "I wished to thank you," Catherine began, her voice steady but lacking the vitality that one might expect from someone recently absolved of guilt, "for your role in bringing the truth to light, for your understanding that I was not the perpetrator of my father's death but rather a victim of manipulation." Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. "My dear, I do not believe that thanks are appropriate. I merely observed the patterns of behavior that were evident to anyone willing to look closely enough. The guilt was yours only in the sense that you had been led to assume it. The actual responsibility lay entirely with those who orchestrated the scheme." "And yet," Catherine said, "the village has not truly forgiven me. They have accepted that I was not deliberately complicit, but they cannot quite manage to forget that I was involved at all. I remain, in their collective consciousness, somehow connected to the crime. Unmarked, perhaps, but marked nonetheless." This observation was, Miss Marple reflected, profoundly accurate. The village's social memory was not so much forgiving as it was selective, and Catherine's mere presence served as a constant reminder of the murder that had occurred within their midst. The fact that she had been a victim of that crime seemed almost irrelevant to her continued status as an outsider. "I have decided to leave Thornfield," Catherine continued, "permanently this time. I have arranged for the sale of my father's house to a solicitor from London who intends to use it as a country residence. I will take the proceeds and begin again somewhere else, somewhere where my name is not synonymous with death and deception." Miss Marple experienced a moment of genuine sadness at this decision. Catherine was, in many respects, the true innocent victim of the entire affair. more innocent even than Eleanor Ashford, who had at least possessed knowledge of events and had chosen complicity through silence. Yet the village, in its complicated moral calculus, could not extend genuine forgiveness to those whose innocent involvement had nonetheless connected them to crime. "Where will you go?" Miss Marple asked gently. "To Scotland," Catherine replied. "I have a distant cousin there who has suggested that I might take up residence in her household. A quiet place, remote from all of this. A place where I might attempt finally to put the past behind me." They spoke for another hour, and by the time Catherine departed, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the true cost of the investigation's resolution. The discovery of truth, she reflected, was not always accompanied by the emergence of justice. Sometimes truth merely illuminated the complexity of human affairs, revealing layers of culpability and victimization that could not be neatly categorized or easily resolved. Catherine would leave Thornfield with her reputation officially cleared, but her life fundamentally disrupted. Robert Ashford would face trial and imprisonment for his crimes, but Eleanor would likely emerge relatively unscathed, her departure positioning her as a woman who had discovered her husband's treachery rather than as a woman who had knowingly permitted it to occur. Dr. Hastings would establish a new practice somewhere distant, his professional misconduct attributed to coercion rather than malice. And Thornfield itself would eventually restore its surface tranquility, would eventually forget the scandal and the disruption, would eventually absorb these events into its collective history as merely another chapter in the ongoing narrative of village life. The autumn would give way to winter, which would give way to spring, and the natural cycles of life and death would continue their inexorable progression. But the village would not be unchanged. The comfortable assumption of order and propriety would have been forever altered by the recognition that darkness could exist beneath even the most carefully maintained facades of respectability. The trial of Robert Ashford took place in late November, conducted with the meticulous formality that characterized the English legal system. Miss Marple attended the proceedings, observing from her position in the gallery with the same quiet attention she had brought to every aspect of the investigation. The courtroom, with its polished wood and high ceilings, seemed designed to emphasize the gravity of legal consequence, the seriousness with which society regarded the violation of its fundamental laws. The case against Robert Ashford was, from a prosecutorial standpoint, considerably more complex than one might have initially anticipated. The charge of manslaughter through criminal negligence required demonstrating that Robert's actions constituted a gross breach of duty of care, that his conduct had been of such nature as to amount to a criminal act or omission. The difficulty lay in establishing that Robert had possessed sufficient knowledge of the probable consequences of his scheme to warrant such serious charges. The defense argued, with considerable sophistication, that Robert had genuinely believed the sedative to be harmless, that he had acted under considerable emotional duress, and that the ultimate cause of Edward Merton's death was his pre-existing heart condition rather than any deliberate action on Robert's part. The prosecution countered by demonstrating that Robert had deliberately concealed the true nature of the scheme from Catherine Merton, suggesting that he had possessed some awareness of the morally questionable nature of his conduct, even if he had not anticipated fatal consequences. Constable Wilson testified regarding the investigation's findings. Dr. Hastings, having agreed to cooperate with the prosecution in exchange for reduced charges, provided damaging testimony regarding Robert's specific requests and the assurances he had provided regarding the sedative's safety. Reverend Thornton testified regarding Catherine's confession in the sacrament, carefully navigating the boundaries of the seal of the confessional while providing sufficient detail to establish Robert's complicity. But it was Miss Marple's testimony that seemed to crystallize the case most effectively. Called to the stand at the prosecution's request, she provided a detailed account of the investigation's progression, of the pattern of behaviors that had pointed toward Robert's guilt, and of the psychological factors that had motivated his actions. When asked by the prosecution to summarize her understanding of Robert's character and motivations, she delivered her assessment with characteristic gentleness. Mr. Ashford is a man who has always perceived himself as deserving of a position in society that his actual abilities and ethical foundation do not warrant," she said, her voice calm and measured. He became accustomed to taking what he had not earned, to manipulating those around him to serve his purposes, and to rationalizing his actions through a process of self-deception. When faced with exposure, he did not consider accepting responsibility. Instead, he sought to remove the obstacle, his prospective father-in-law, from the situation entirely. He did not intend murder, but he was willing to risk harm to others to preserve his own position. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on the charge of manslaughter. Robert Ashford was sentenced to 7 years of imprisonment, a sentence that seemed to devastate him more through its length than through its severity. He had, Miss Marple reflected, believed himself incapable of serious consequences, had somehow imagined that his social position might protect him from the ordinary workings of justice. In the weeks following the trial, Thornfield gradually returned to something approximating its former equilibrium. The vicar's Christmas preparations proceeded with their usual efficiency. The village shops began their seasonal displays. The patterns of ordinary life reasserted themselves with the persistence of natural law, yet there remained a subtle alteration in the community's collective consciousness, an awareness that the comfortable assumptions of village propriety could be overturned by the machinations of ordinary people pursuing extraordinary selfishness. Miss Marple sat in her cottage on a cold December evening, her knitting needles working their familiar pattern. The case was resolved. The guilty had been identified and punished, and the innocent, or at least the less guilty, had begun the process of re-establishing their lives. Catherine Merton was settling into her new residence in Scotland. Dr. Hastings had accepted a position in a small practice in Cornwall. Eleanor Ashford had taken up residence in London, where her connections and financial resources would permit her to reinvent herself in the relative anonymity of the city. Yet what struck Miss Marple most forcefully, as she reflected upon the entire affair, was not the resolution itself, but rather the human capacity for self-deception that had permitted all of these events to occur in the first place. Robert Ashford had genuinely convinced himself that his embezzlement was temporary, that his scheme to incapacitate his future father-in-law was harmless. Dr. Hastings had persuaded himself that he was merely obliging a desperate young man, that no real harm would result. Eleanor Ashford had silenced her own misgivings by refusing to articulate what she suspected, and Catherine Merton, innocent though she was, had accepted responsibility for her father's death rather than acknowledge the far more uncomfortable possibility that those she had trusted had deliberately deceived her. Miss Marple set down her knitting and moved to her window, gazing out at the snow-covered high street of Thornfield. The village appeared peaceful in the winter darkness, its lights glowing warmly in the windows of its various houses. To an outside observer, it would seem a place of contentment and safety, a repository of traditional English virtue and community spirit. But Miss Marple knew better. She had spent a lifetime observing villages very much like Thornfield, had come to understand that the surface tranquility of such communities concealed depths of human complexity that were often as dark as those found in the largest cities. The difference was merely one of scale and visibility. In a village, the workings of human nature were compressed, made intimate, impossible to ignore for those willing to observe carefully. She thought of Edward Merton, dead these 5 years, whose integrity and principle had ultimately been the cause of his own destruction. She thought of Catherine bearing unwarranted guilt. She thought of Dr. Hastings, compromising his principles for the sake of a friend's desperation. She thought of Robert Ashford, imprisoned for the consequences of his own selfishness. And she thought, as she often did after concluding an investigation, of the fundamental patterns of human behavior that recurred across time and circumstance, that appeared in villages and cities, among the wealthy and the poor, the educated and the ignorant. The capacity for deception, for self-justification, for the rationalization of one's own culpability, these seemed to be constants in the human condition, variations upon themes that had been played out since the beginning of human society. The letter without a name, had arrived in Thornfield, had disrupted its careful equilibrium, and had forced the village to confront truths it would have preferred to leave undisturbed. And now, in the quiet of her cottage on a winter evening, Miss Marple reflected that this was perhaps the true function of such investigations, not merely to solve crimes, but to illuminate the hidden landscape of human nature that lay beneath the surface of ordinary life. She picked up her knitting again, her needles resuming their steady rhythm. The case was closed. The village would heal, would return to its customary patterns. And Miss Marple, ever observant, ever patient, would continue her quiet work of understanding the endlessly complex mechanisms of human behavior, secure in the knowledge that wherever people gathered, wherever society was organized, there would always be mysteries, waiting to be unraveled by those patient enough and observant enough to look closely enough. Outside, the snow continued to fall silently on Thornfield, covering the village in a blanket of white that concealed all imperfections, all scars, all evidence of the darkness that had so recently erupted from beneath the surface of its carefully maintained respectability.